the fourth in our series of book club talks. The book club was started by the CCP as part of its efforts to promote the humanities aspects of medicine. And we felt that we needed a more rounded and a more humane doctor. So we thought we will reach out to the medical humanities, and as part of that, we've started the CCP Book Club. Then we've had 3 talks before. Diniti spoke about slow medicine, which was an eye-opener to all of us. Then Professor Sam Kularatna spoke about the bitter story of coffee, how it was in Sri Lanka, and a dark period of our nation's history, which we must be fully aware of. Many lessons to learn from that as well. The third in the series was when our good friend Herman Malinge Gunratna, celebrated author in Sri Lanka, he spoke about the journey of tea in Sri Lanka, using some of his own books, including The Suicide Club. And then this evening, we are having the fourth. So very warm welcome to Dr. Lakmali Amarasiri, who volunteered. Actually, when we started the book club, we invited members who were keen to speak about a book to volunteer, and she has joined our team. So we will have this monthly, and next month also we will have another book club talk like this. So this evening, a very warm welcome to this evening's speaker, Dr. Lakmali Amarasiri, and a very warm welcome again to all my friends who have joined this program to enjoy our foray into classical literature. And as my dear teacher, Professor Aryananda, commented, we are not merely stimulating the left hemisphere of the brain, but we are on a journey to stimulate the right hemisphere of the brain also in the CCP 2022. So over to Madhuanti, who is called Dr. Madhuanti Hettiarachchi, who is coordinating this book club activity, to introduce the speaker, and then of course tell you all how things are going to be. Over to you, Madhuanti.
Thank you, Arulta. Good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Madhuanti Hettiarachchi. Welcome you all to the 4th reading at the CCP Book Club. Amidst all the chaos of the day-to-day life, when there's looming uncertainty, we still look for the light at the end of the tunnel. Today, our speaker is Dr. Lakmali Amarasiri. She's a senior lecturer in the Department of Physiology, affiliated to the Faculty of Medicine, University of Colombo. She has a special interest in respiratory physiology, and she's also a partner of a creative venture that curates customized gifts whilst empowering individuals and communities and small-scale businesses for sustainable livelihood through craft. And she's a voracious reader, dabbles in painting, and actually she's a creative writer and passionate about photography. And most of all, she's my good friend, and she's from our junior batch also. And today she'll be talking to us on an all-time favorite author, Jane Austen's books, and the Austen treatment turning to Jane Austen in tumultuous times. So join us to explore what solace can be found in the life and the words of Jane Austen, drawing inspiration from 2 of her books, Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. So without much ado, let's invite Dr. Lakmali to start her talk. Over to you, Lakmali.
Thank you, Madhuanti. Is it possible for me to share the screen now? Yes, it is. Can you see the screen? Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So good evening, everyone. I'm so very pleased to be here today. And I would like to thank the Ceylon College of Physicians for inviting me to this event. And I look forward to the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite authors. When Madhvanti invited me to talk at the book club and I accepted her invitation, it took me some time to think and some discussion with a few kindred spirits about what book to talk about. I wanted to relate to the difficult times and emotional turmoil that we are going through now. And I also wanted to talk about a book that I was sure most of you would have read at some point in time, so that it would hopefully spark recognition and a good discussion. Now, I'm sure that many of you here would have encountered Jane Austen at some point in your lives. And for those who haven't yet made her acquaintance, I do have a synopsis with images from my favorite screen adaptations of the books to add some color to my presentation. I hope I won't throw out too many spoilers in the process, but even if I do, believe me when I say that Austen's works are enjoyably rereadable. So as we all are painfully aware at this moment, we are as a country going through immense turmoil due to many external forces that have bombarded us relentlessly, one after the other. And I would not be wrong to say that we are going through one of the most difficult times that we have ever faced. However, even without any of that, we all do face emotional turmoil due to many reasons, be it challenges of day-to-day activities, relationships, chronic illness, bereavement, and such situations are then amplified during times of external turmoil. Now, when we are with issue, we become emotional, and emotion gives rise to actions and sometimes chaos. And some of the chaos we experience are actually created by conventions and institutions within us. And when we are in such a situation, we feel that a substantial part of our lives is missing and that we are trapped. It is difficult to cope with emotions and difficulties when they happen to us, but it makes it so much easier to bear when we find that others are going through the same. And this is where great literature steps in, affording us escapism. We read and we find characters that are either going through what we are going through, or we see characters who we can relate to. And the stories tell us that this has all happened before in a different time with different names, but similar narratives. And they tell us that it's perfectly fine to be scared, to have complicated feelings, to feel a bit lost. And they remind us that we are human. And seeing how others cope gives us hope that things may hopefully turn out all right. Now, some of us turn to dystopian literature to better understand emotions and finding solace in books that ask dark, what-if questions. Others, like myself, look to more light-hearted distraction and those that have happy endings. So why I selected Austen today is simply because I'm a die-hard Jane Austen fan. And I remembered how a few years ago, when I was at the lowest point in my life, I was bedridden, quite miserable following an accident. I read and reread all of Jane's books and watched and rewatched all the screen adaptations available. In short, I applied myself to what I now know as the Austen treatment. And I remember how pleasantly distracted I was from my current situation as I lost myself in her stories. And so let me take you through the life and works of Jane Austen as I talk about the Austen treatment, about turning to Jane Austen in tumultuous times with my interpretation on how comfort can be sought from Austen's life and her works. And I'll be taking inspiration from her first two published works. Jane Austen lived and wrote in a period that might have seemed to her almost as convulsive as ours does to us. She was born in 1775 and grew up with her brothers and sister in a modest and cheerful family home in the rectory at Steventon, where she wrote the first drafts of what would become Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. Her father was the rector of the local parish and taught her largely at home. And she was exceptionally close to her sister Cassandra, who probably influences the sisterly bond that we see in many of her works. When he realized that she would not marry, Jane's father encouraged her to become a professional writer as a means of earning, to which her mother, who was a witty poet herself, wholeheartedly agreed. So just before her 25th birthday, much to her dismay, her father announced that they would move to Bath, which actually disturbed her creative streak. However, after his death and after much moving around, Jane was able to return to her beloved New Hampshire home, where she grew up in and completed her books. Jane's own life was a lesson in forbearance. She was from a middle-class family, and as middle-class families go, her daily life seemed an endless struggle. She had to endure loss of her father, her home, her love interest, her confidence about the future, undergoing relentless writing and revision, difficulties and disappointments in publishing, and achieving quite late success and financial security as an author. She published 6 novels in the space of 7 years, and she chose to be anonymous to the reading public until later on, and sadly died at the age of only 41, at the prime of her creativity. Her 6 immortal novels based in the 19th century take inspiration from her life and have won the hearts of millions of readers, spurring many book and screen adaptations and numerous fan clubs over the years. There's indeed no other like Jane Austen to show us the value of examining our emotions. As you read her stories, you find yourself identifying with her characters and strategies to cope. She has this immense power to connect because she knows grief, pain, and fear, and what it is like to feel vulnerable, exposed, and anxious about the well-being of those she cares about. And through her writing, she comforts us and challenges us, embracing the dark and lonely aspects of life, but also adding the lightness of touch and a much-needed humor. Her first published novel was Sense and Sensibility, published in 1811, followed 2 years later by Pride and Prejudice, which is probably her most beloved and widely read book. Both books were initially written as epistolary novels or as letters, and published more than a decade later, each as 3 volumes. And they were anonymous. So Sense and Sensibility was published by a lady, and Pride and Prejudice by the author of Sense and Sensibility. Both are love stories about finding your way, about family and obligations, and a story about sisters. She subsequently wrote 4 more novels, Mansfield Park, Emma, Northanger Abbey, and Persuasion. And the last 2 were published a year after her death. Now, a talk on Jane Austen would not be complete if I did not at some point bring up the most iconic sentence uttered by her in Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. When researching for this talk, I came across a declaration that it is perhaps also a truth universally acknowledged that it is a rite of passage in every woman's life to read Jane Austen. And it is true. We are thrilled to find out that her heroines and the characters around them are flawed and imperfect as we are. They teach us how to cope with the problems in our lives as they muddle through their own. And they too have their fair share of problems, financial issues, matrimonial chaos, social faux pas, errors in judgment, you name it, Jane Austen has it all. And then there are those who would mischaracterize her novels as romantic escapism and say, oh, these novels are all the same. They're about girls finding a husband. And true, all of Jane's stories are love stories about how her heroines find happiness by marriage. But can you fault Jane for that? This was a time that social advancement for young men lay either in the military or the church or the law. But the only way that women could accomplish this goal was through successful marriage. So even though the main preoccupation of Jane's books is love and romance at their core, they have a lot to say about perseverance and resilience, and it makes them perfect reading for troubled times. I mean, just think about it. In the midst of a pandemic, we can look to Austen's characters who only leave the house to take long walks and essential trips. They wear gloves, they write letters to faraway friends and engage in hobbies. They maintain a respectable distance of at least 6 feet while in public, and sometimes skip large gatherings like parties or balls. And they have to be satisfied with their lot. Does that sound familiar? So even though we talk about romantic escapism, it is not only the fair and faint-hearted that have sought escapism through Austen's works. In the First World War, Cheap editions of Austen's books were printed for soldiers to read in the trenches. They were also prescribed to veterans suffering from severe shell shock, or what we know as post-traumatic stress disorder. And then another example of Austen treatment was Rudyard Kipling's The Janeites, published in 1924. Kipling's soldier characters named weapons and nurses after Austen characters and connected with each other as special members of a secret society. More fame, the A.A. Milne of Winnie the Pooh fame, also bonded with his fellow soldiers over his love of Austen. And another notable figure who relied on her in times of war was Winston Churchill, who, when recovering from a bout of pneumonia, had his daughter read Pride and Prejudice to him. And it is said that he said with wistful envy, what calm lives they had, those people, as he felt that whilst he was in the throes of war, the biggest problem for the Bennets and the Darcys and the Bingleys of Jane's world concerned manners and what to wear and natural passions. And now, approximately 100 years later, the whole world finds themselves in need of the Austen treatment. So it's not possible for me to lay before you all the genius in Jane's book that relate to the Austen treatment due to time constraints. But what I will do is take examples from the titles of the two books that we're discussing today. The key insight that is offered by Sense and Sensibility seems to be maintaining emotional balance. Jane uses Sense and Sensibility to show us that excess of either sense and sensibility can be harmful. It is the story of the impoverished Dashwood family, focusing on the calm and sedate sister Elinor and the passionate and headstrong younger sister Marianne, who are personifications of good sense or common sense and sensibility, which to her meant emotionality. One of Jane Austen's greatest accomplishments is the introduction of the nature of the key female characters very early on in the first chapters, so that we form an early bond with them and start rooting for them. In Sense and Sensibility, Elinor is described as possessed a strength of understanding and coolness of judgment, which qualified her, though only 19, to be the counselor of her mother and enabled her frequently to counteract, to the advantage of them all, that eagerness of mind in Mrs. Dashwood, which must generally have led to imprudence. She had an excellent heart, her disposition was affectionate, and her feelings were strong, but she knew how to govern them. It was a knowledge which her mother had yet to learn, and which one of her sisters resolved never to be taught. That sister was Marianne, who Jane describes as sensible and clever, but eager in everything. Her sorrows, her joys could have no moderation. She was generous, amiable, interesting. She was everything but prudent. The two sisters become destitute upon the death of their father, who leaves his home, Norland Park, to their half-brother John. Although he was instructed to take care of his sisters, John is discouraged of his duty by his greedy wife, Fanny, who swoops in to take charge of the household. Elinor meets Fanny's brother, Edward Ferrars, when he comes to visit, and they're attracted to each other, though no feelings are declared at that point. Mrs. Dashwood and her three daughters, Elinor, Marianne, and little Margaret, moved to Barton Cottage in Devonshire, lent to them by distant relatives, the Middletons. This cottage becomes the place where a range of encounters and relationships develop, a testing time for them, as they need to adapt to a penniless, less comfortable situation and suffer the kindness awarded to them by their hosts, who mean well, but a little unfeelingly. It is here that the open and enthusiastic Marianne meets Colonel Brandon, a bachelor 20 years her senior. He expresses an interest in Marianne, though she discourages his attention because she becomes infatuated with the attractive John Willoughby, who seems to be a romantic lover, but is in reality an unscrupulous fortune hunter. Willoughby openly and shamelessly courts Marianne, and together the two flaunt their attachment to one another until Willoughby suddenly departs for London on business, leaving Marianne lovesick and miserable. During this time, Elinor is heartbroken too, as she learns that Edward has been secretly engaged for several years to Lucy Steele, a relative of Mrs. Jennings. Although Edward loves Eleanor, he is determined to honor his commitment to Lucy. Eleanor and Marianne travel to London with Mrs. Jennings and Lucy. Marianne with the hope of seeing her beloved Willoughby, and Eleanor harboring thoughts of Edward. But all does not end well in London, as Willoughby cruelly rebuffs Marianne and deserts her for a wealthy heiress. And when the engagement to Lucy is revealed, Edward is disowned by his mother, and then Colonel Brandon offers him a living as clergyman, which enables him to marry Lucy now, and then thus removes any hope that Eleanor might have had for securing him for herself. The two sisters travel back home. On the way back, whilst at a friend's, Marianne falls gravely ill after being caught in the rain, and her illness gives her time to reflect on her past relationship. She says, "My illness has made me think and given me leisure and calmness for serious recollection. Long before I was enough recovered to talk, I was perfectly able to reflect. I considered the past. I saw in my own behavior. I saw that my own feelings had prepared my sufferings. My illness, I well knew, had been entirely brought on myself. Had I died, it would have been self-destruction." Thus Marianne reflects and comes to peace with her past and finds comfort with Colonel Brandon. Now around this time, Eleanor is also devastated as she learns that Mr. Ferrars has married. However, it turns out that Lucy has actually wed Edward's brother, Robert. And Edward arrives at Barton Cottage and proposes to Eleanor, who accepts. So all's well that ends well. Throughout most of the book, we see how the two sisters respond to happiness and to difficulties differently as per their nature. We see Marianne screaming through the village on a curricle with the man she likes, and then drowning her sorrows in Shakespeare and the pouring rain. Marianne's overt expression of her feelings often leads to heartbreak. However, with time, she takes time to reflect and learns that emotion, tempered by reason, is preferable, and finds contentment in a calmer and deeper love. On the other hand, Eleanor suffers in silence, refusing to acknowledge her emotions, and even though this seems admirable from the outside, it is exhausting to be that person all the time. Jane shows us through Eleanor that those who are thought to be calm and collected in the face of adversity, though thought to be admirable, sometimes do wish they are not. We see in chapter 26, where Eleanor wishes that she had some of the romance in her life that her younger sister was experiencing. Jane describes, "Eleanor, in spite of every occasional doubt of Willoughby's constancy, could not witness the rapture of delightful expectation which filled the whole soul and beamed in the eyes of Marianne, without feeling how blank was her own prospect, how cheerless her own state of the mind in comparison, and how gladly she would engage in the solitude of Marianne's situation." And further on, when Marianne says, "Always resignation and acceptance, always prudence, honor and duty, Eleanor, where is your heart?" she responds vehemently, "You do not suppose that I have felt much. For 4 months, Marianne, I have had all this hanging on my mind without being at liberty to speak of it to a single creature, knowing that it would make you and my mother most unhappy. It was told me, nay, it was forced on me by the very person herself whose prior engagement ruined all my prospects. And it has not been only once. I have had her hopes and exultation to listen to again and again. I have had to contend against the unkindness of his sister and the insolence of his mother, and have suffered the punishment of an attachment without enjoying its advantages. The composure of mind with which I have brought myself at present to consider the matter have been the effort of constant and painful exertion. Then, if I had not been bound to silence, perhaps nothing could have kept me entirely from openly showing that I was very unhappy." To hear this outpouring from the calm and collected Eleanor shows us the extent of heartbreak that Eleanor has been holding in, and it is heartening to see her outburst, expressing all the emotions that she has been keeping bottled up. So thereafter, when she hears that Edward is free and is not in fact married to Lucy Steele, Austen writes in the novel, Elinor could sit no longer. She almost ran the room as soon as the door closed, burst into tears of joy, which at first she thought would never cease. And so we see how the Dashwood sisters achieve emotional balance, which makes us think that we too could change our ways of responding and adapt to better face troubled times. Now, from Devonshire, I will now move on to Pride and Prejudice, the ultimate love story of how Elizabeth and her true love, Mr. Darcy, overcome all obstacles, including their own personal failings, to find romantic happiness. The story revolves around Elizabeth Bennet with her sharp tongue and tendency to make hasty judgments, which often lead her astray. Elizabeth must not only cope with a hopeless hypochondriac mother, a distant father, two badly behaved younger siblings, and several snobbish, antagonizing females, but she must also overcome her own mistaken impressions of Mr. Darcy, which initially led her to reject his proposal of marriage. We can all remember how we held our breath as the proud and haughty Mr. Darcy declares that this will not do, I have struggled in vain. You must allow me to declare how ardently I love you. But to no avail, as Elizabeth has misjudged his character. Yes, despite her refusal, her charms are sufficient to keep him interested, even while she goes through multiple familial and social turmoil. And she gradually comes to recognize the nobility of his character, and she realizes the error of her initial prejudice against him. The book starts with the news that the wealthy Mr. Bingley is renting at the Fields and creates much excitement in the village of Longbourn, especially among the Bennet household. The Bennets have 5 unmarried daughters, from oldest to youngest, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. And Mrs. Bennet is desperate to see them all married. Let me take a little time to read from the famous encounter between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet regarding this exciting news. My dear Mr. Bennet, said his lady to him one day, have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last? Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. But it is, returned she, for Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it. Mr. Bennet made no answer. Do not you want to know who has taken it? Cried his wife impatiently. You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it. This was invitation enough. Why, my dear, you must know, Mrs. Long said, that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week. What is his name? Bingley. Is he married or single? Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4,000 and 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls. How so? How can it affect them? My dear Mr. Bennet, replied his wife, how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I'm thinking of his marrying one of them. Is that his design in settling here? Design? Nonsense. How can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes. I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better, for as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley might like you the best of the party. My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. In such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of. But my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighborhood. It is more than I engage for, I assure you. But consider your daughters. Only think what an establishment it would be for one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go, merely on that account. For in general, you know, they visit no newcomers. Indeed, you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not. You are over-scrupulous, surely. I dare say Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you. and I will send a few lines by you to assure him of my hearty consent to his marrying whichever he chooses of the girls, though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie. I desire you will do no such thing. Lizzie is not a bit better than the others, and I'm sure she is not half as handsome as Jane, nor half as good-humored as Lydia, but you're always giving her the preference. They have none of them much to recommend them, replied he. They are all silly and ignorant like other girls, but Lizzie has something more of quickness than her sisters. Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion on my poor nerves. You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these 20 years at least. Ah, you do not know what I suffer, but I hope you will get over it and live to see many young men of 4,000 a year come into the neighborhood. It will be no use to us if 20 such should come, since you will not visit them. Depend upon it, my dear, that when there are 20, I will visit them all. And by this brilliant narrative in the first few paragraphs of chapter 1, Jane imparts the flavor of the exciting tale that is to come with promise of wit and humor, and we are instantly drawn in. Such is the genius of Jane Austen. As the story unravels, Mrs. Bennet is determined to match one of her 5 daughters with the unsuspecting Bingley. Her 2 daughters, however, refuse to marry except for love. I am determined that only the deepest love will induce me to matrimony, says Elizabeth to Jane. Luckily for Mrs. Bennet, once they meet, both Jane and Bingley seem enraptured with one another. However, it is Bingley's serious and prideful friend that strikes Elizabeth. On first impression, Mr. Darcy represents everything that strong-willed Elizabeth finds detestable in a man. Elizabeth is also far too bold for Darcy's liking. Yet, as they are forced into each other's company time and time again, Mr. Darcy finds himself increasingly attracted to Elizabeth's charm and intelligence, much to the disdain of the snobbish Miss Bingley, Charles Bingley's sister, who also has her sights set on Darcy. Both Elizabeth and Darcy try to hold their true initial feelings of dislike until events outside of their control bring to face their errors of judgment and reveal a secret fondness brewing in both of their hearts. But Pride and Prejudice is just not love and romance. Through the book, Jane teaches the follies of pride, which at that time meant someone thinking that he was better than the others or did not want to interact with different kinds of people, and prejudice, which meant basing judgments on reputation, gossip, or misunderstandings, and the importance of correcting such opinions while offering a lot of satirical humor as a distraction. So this is escapism at its best. The arguments and counter-arguments of Elizabeth and Darcy are legendary, as they are both prideful and prejudiced, and they keep us in suspense. At Netherfield, when Elizabeth visits to tend to Jane, who's recovering from a fever, they argue about the virtues of the female sex. Elizabeth says, I'm no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder at you knowing any. To which Darcy retorts, are you so severe upon your sex as to doubt the possibility of all this? They continue to argue about vanity and pride, however, not realizing that through this banter, they're beginning to look at themselves and start on a path towards self-reflection. When Darcy says, I have faults enough, they are not, I hope, of understanding. My temper I dare not vouch for. I cannot forget the follies and vices of others so soon as I ought, nor their offenses against myself. My temper would perhaps be called resentful. My good opinion, once lost, is lost forever. To which Elizabeth says, that is a failing indeed. However, they begin to mellow towards each other into playful banter. And at one instance, when she says, your defect is a propensity to hate everybody, he says, and yours is willfully to misunderstand them. And Jane says, he replied with a smile. At a further encounter at Rosings at the home of Darcy's aunt, when Darcy approaches Elizabeth, who is forced to play the piano, Elizabeth says, you mean to frighten me, Mr. Darcy, by coming in all this state to hear me? There's a stubbornness about me that can never bear to be frightened at the will of others. My courage always rises with every attempt to intimidate me. And he replies, and I have had the pleasure of your acquaintance long enough to know that you find great enjoyment in occasionally professing opinions, which in fact are not your own. As time goes on, Elizabeth begins to like Darcy, which she jokingly states came upon her when she first saw his large estate at Pemberley. However, it is the final encounter with Darcy's aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is vehemently against the union, that pushes her to realize her feelings. And it is this key conversation that gives Darcy hope that Elizabeth would not refuse him again. So they go out walking and he tells her that his feelings have not altered. She tenderly accepts his proposal, and both Jane and Elizabeth are married. Jane Austen shows that anyone is capable of being prideful and prejudiced, but those who are able to rethink their initial judgments are the ones who are most likely to lead happy lives. Psychologists call such emotional growth a growth mindset, a key principle that life should be lived as a constant process of adapting to challenges and accepting and learning from your mistakes. It is not only about Darcy that Elizabeth has prejudice. She does not approve of the marriage of her great friend Charlotte Lucas, in her opinion, to the ridiculous Mr. Collins. However, when she goes to visit her after her marriage, she realizes that Charlotte has accurately assessed her priorities and has chosen accordingly. And therefore, Elizabeth is forced to meditate upon Charlotte's degree of contentment and to accept that she has done very well. Pride and Prejudice also offers a multitude of coping strategies through the brilliant roles played by the other characters. Jane offers a hopefulness and anticipation of happiness that would have been lacking if only Eliza and Darcy were left on the pages. The dialogues and the antics of the other three sisters, the foolishness of the well-meaning mother, and the ridiculousness of Mr. Collins are a pure joy to read. Perhaps it's Mr. Bennet who best words it, for what do we live but to make sport for our neighbors and laugh at them in our turn? Even in the most tumultuous of moments, Jane has an effective way of raising the spirits. I can never read Elizabeth Bennet's tussle with Lady Catherine de Bourgh without feeling exhilarated, and be side with Elizabeth when she's snubbed, and then feel elated when she scores one over Caroline Bingley. And finally, Pride and Prejudice also deals with scandal in the form of Wickham, a scoundrel who tries to entice young girls for lust or for money, including Mr. Darcy's young sister, who escapes in the nick of time. But unfortunately, Lydia, Elizabeth's sister, becomes a victim. And don't we all know the power that a good, juicy scandal has to distract us from any calamity? And there we have it, the Austen world. A charming world where idiosyncrasies of her characters cause most of the action, just like in real life. And so the next time you feel down, maybe turn to Jane Austen for her characters and her plots that have similarities to our lives that allow us to contemplate our current situations. To find that we can retreat into her books, safe in the knowledge that we would find nothing there to remind us of our current fears and anxieties. For her work, which would be a safe haven, where we can give ourselves up to all the pleasure she so brilliantly delivers. Her wonderful, wonderful characters, her idyllic landscapes, beautiful estates, elegant attire, wit and humor, and of course, those gloriously satisfying happy endings. And if that fails, I suggest that we do what all Jane's heroines did back then. Simply go for a walk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lakmali. Actually, you have taken us through a wonderful journey through Jane Austen's books. Actually, just wanted to ask if there are anybody who is willing to ask any questions from Lakmali. I think she'll be happy to answer.
I'm actually looking forward because I know there are some Janeites in the audience. I just wanted to know whether there were any other instances when you came across her books where you felt that you could relate to Jane, and that it helped you cope, possibly.
Hi, Lakmali, this is Madhika here. It was great listening to, I felt like I was reading the book and I actually thought you were like with act it out, which was excellent. You brought out all the emotion in your voice and all of that was wonderful. Yeah, what you said was also especially about the part where it teaches us a lesson to reflect. We are all human, we make mistakes, and all of these women, Jane's girls, all made mistakes, but they were able to reflect on the mistake they did and maybe take a walk and get back to what life was in store for them. But then also when I read this, I feel glad for the times that we are in now. That era, the women were so dependent on the men. They would sometimes just look out for someone to get married to, because if they didn't, they would have to go out to the road. If they didn't have a brother or if there was no male in the family, it would be some far off cousin who would come and inherit everything and they would go to the streets. So the changes that have happened with time and the times we are living in now, where women are so much more, independent. Yes, we have all the stresses of work and everything also, but then I would rather have that know that, there was a time when women were so dependent on men to do anything, even to, to live in their own home. So yeah, so that also makes me thankful about the times we are in now. And like you said, all this she brings out the sisterly relationships, and she sort of shows that the girls in the story stick by each other no matter what, and that is another good lesson for life, to have that sister or that friend who would adjust your crown every time it falls, kind of thing. So it's a really feel-good novel. Both of these and all of Jane's books are feel-good novels that I guess anybody should go to when they are feeling down. Thanks a lot, Lakmali.
Thank you, Madhuka. Okay. It does feel funny, isn't it, that when we read, we feel sometimes grateful for the fact that we are living in this era now. But sometimes when this era kind of overwhelms us, we find that we would love to go back, that we would like to go back to that era and, get respite from where we are currently. So it's, I suppose, I don't know, not a win-win situation, I suppose.
Hi, Lakmali, Ashwini here.
Hi, Ashwini.
Thank you so much for that lovely presentation. It was like walking through the books, holding hands with your friends. I'd like to know your thoughts about something. It's not everyone can write female characters well. Right? And sometimes we come across female characters who are very two-dimensional and not whole. But we see, Eleanor, Marianne, the Bennett sisters, all of them have this personality character of their own, which is unique and which I think is remarkable. What are your thoughts? Have you noticed it in other books? And I'd love to know your thoughts about it.
This is my perspective, of course. I think the reason why each of Jane's heroines, all these characters, they had a personality of their own is probably because they were based on Jane's life or Jane's experiences, Jane's life. And I think each of them represented her in different aspects. And I think that's one thing about when you write, you can make it personal. I think you can put more depth and more personality into your characters. And I feel that is the reason why Jane's characters all come out very strongly and as individuals with minds of their own and very, very deep characters. I feel that is the reason. But I would love to know anyone else's thoughts on this.
Thanks, Lakmali. Really interesting.
Does anyone else have take on that? That is what I felt.
This is Rochana speaking. So about that, I do agree that Jane Austen writes perfect female characters, which are not one-dimensional or two-dimensional. I think the reason is that Jane Austen did not really bother to sort of cater to a male audience. So so the general opinion people had of women back then was that, women were very submissive because of their, station in life and so on. So people thought that women were submissive and they just listened to whatever that was, dictated to them. But then Jane Austen shows that women were not in fact that. They had their own ways of, everyday resistance. They had their own ways of sort of subverting patriarchy and also, social dictates and so on. So I think that is what is so refreshing about Jane Austen's female characters. We can relate to them because of that, because there are so many novels either written by women or written by men, which just sort of show women to sort of just submit to whatever that is dictated to them, or just listen to whatever that is told to them. So I think what is refreshing is that Jane Austen's heroines, they talk back and they do whatever they want, and they try to they use tools of the patriarchy to sort of subvert patriarchy itself. So I think that's what's going on there. I just wanted to add that.
But it's interesting. Thank you, Rochana. So it's interesting that even though these women are now at that era, it was where women were supposed to be submissive and not very strong, or didn't have much of a voice and so on. But still, about 100 years ago, at the time of the First World War and so on, still even men found Jane's characters and heroines quite entertaining. So it's quite heartening to see that, despite that, even that, because it's like everyone links Jane Austen with females, that it's mostly the females who call themselves, the Jane Austen fans. But, even the male sex, I think Rudyard Kipling, he wrote about the Janeites, who were actually a group of men who were following Jane Austen. So that's quite interesting to see.
Yes.
Okay, so
Lakmali, may I make a comment, ask a question?
Yes.
Would that be okay? I just, what the more recent comments were made about how authentic her depictions of women and women's relationships are, more comment really than a question, but I think she is very accurate about the relations between women, and maybe would not find that unexpected. But it's an interesting observation that nowhere in her novels do we get a description of a conversation between two men that is not being observed by a woman who is relating and commenting on what's happening, or overhearing and interpreting what happens. So it's a lovely example of writing what you know. And I wondered if you had any comments on that.
Yes, I think there are like instances, like I think at the first ball, I think at Netherfield, was it, where Bingley and Mr. Darcy are talking to each other. And as you said, even there, Elizabeth overhears. And we hear that, we see their conversation, but it's always Elizabeth overhearing. We see either some perspective wherever there is a conversation going on, there's, as you said, there is a woman there. And I suppose it could be probably, I don't know, probably because, as Rochana said, that she probably wrote what she knew, and she didn't care about like catering to the males, probably the male sex. She just wrote what she knew and what she wanted to write, and probably from her, as you said, sir, from her perspective, so that she could not probably put it forward that probably she wanted the females to have a presence, probably, whatever important conversations they were going on. Maybe that's what I feel. I hope that, yeah.
Thank you.
May I make a comment there?
Yes.
So I was wondering whether this is something like what we call the Bechdel test and the reverse Bechdel test about representation in fiction, where the Bechdel test is in fiction or in movies, whether there is a conversation between two named females, a single conversation, which is not about a man. And the reverse Bechdel test is the same about men. So I'm wondering whether we can, I've only seen it applied to movies, but I'm wondering whether we can apply it to contemporary as well as historical fiction like this, and use it as a starting point to talk about representation.
And could it also be, I don't know, could it be that Jane Austen, even though her stories were about romance and ultimately marriage, could it be that she, in most instances, could it be that she actually ridiculed the male sex? Did any of you come across that feeling that she would always bring highlight the female character more than the male character and give more prominence? Did any of you feel such a feeling when you read her works, basically?
This is Rochana, and yes, I have felt that. That's what she does. Yeah, that's what I felt.
Yeah, so as you said, that because she always puts the satire and the humor and the villains and all that into the males, and the females have, they're much less villainous or ridiculous when you compare. And I don't know, sir, Dr. Chandra, whether that actually answers your question. One reason for your reason is because she probably would not let the males, to get prominence, and always would have the female to be around, to be aware of what's going on. Probably.
Yes, Lakmali, I think it is an example of what they always tell writers,
Yes.
is, write about what you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so particularly, I suppose, in that more conservative society, it would have been difficult for a single woman to have an idea of how men on their own communicate with each other. Mm-hmm. But interesting that this Bechdel test is mentioned. Okay. I think Jane Austen would fail it massively, because I think women, spend a lot of time talking about men in their lives or other men that they have met and come across. And it's interesting how films now would be seen in an adverse light for failing this Bechdel test. But what we might call great literature clearly doesn't seem to be bound by those, those limitations.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Anybody like to speak or any questions from the audience? So in the absence of any more questions, Lakmali, I would like to thank you on behalf of Ceylon College of Physicians for that wonderful presentation, and you have made us all walk through Jane Austen's book. And we would really like to have you again in one of the readings. Thank you so much, and good night, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I really enjoyed. Thank you very much for your enthusiastic conversation and comments as well. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.